I'm Nigel Nicholson, the Chief Executive of GreyList Trace Limited, and we're very pleased to be speaking and sponsors of this conference, and very pleased to see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. I think in the last day and a half, if you've managed to avoid meeting a GreyList person, you've done pretty well. If you haven't eaten one of our chocolates, please do, when you exit the conference room. And I'm going to be talking with Jonathan Benton of Intelligent Sanctuary. I think what we're going to talk about, what I'm going to talk about, and what he's going to talk about are very compatible. And we have just over an hour, maybe an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes, or until you tell me to stop. I have a script, not because I don't know what I'm going to say, because it will tell me when I should stop. Then Jonathan will follow, and hopefully we'll have 10 or 15 minutes of time for questions afterwards. And it's quite an interesting topic, obviously artificial, thank you Jonathan, already becoming a double act here, I think. I think we can work well together in the future. Having signed up to do a talk on the use of artificial intelligence, I think in the investigation and compliance arena, except we're going to focus a bit more on the investigation arena, obviously, I needed to go and check what artificial intelligence really was. I didn't know if it was a really complex and scary topic. Is it going to put us all out of work? Or is it just going to be applying common sense in a cyber age where data is increasingly digital to make sense of what we're trying to do? And I think very importantly, by part automating the process, to increase our potential to speed through cases and win cases. We spend all our lives chasing cases that seem to take forever to finish, or the asset takes forever to recover. If we can find a way to speed that process, we're not going to be losing work, we're going to get more work to do, and we'll actually, I think, be a much more, profitable industry as a result of that. So I take a very optimistic view that artificial intelligence empowers us. It doesn't restrict or replace us in any way. Now, by strict definition, I actually still have a dictionary somewhere. It says, it's quite simple actually, artificial intelligence, and I'm going to read this bit, is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. It doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that machines who feed off themselves and we're nowhere in the equation, but it is a very intelligent and sensible use of computer systems. And I think by intuition and experience and maybe looking at the next person, we know that human beings can be brilliant, but they can be very flawed and biased at the same time. But I think that we also know that without some human inspiration, just pressing a button on a machine isn't going to get us very far either. So I think the very good news is it's the intelligent combination of the human intelligence and the machine intelligence that should help us deliver the payload. And I'm guessing actually that every one of you here today is carrying with you something quite amazing. It's a device that has astonishing computing power, that can probably put the whole of human knowledge at your fingertips in just a matter of seconds. I'm referring to your iPhone or your Samsung or whatever other variety you're holding. So this is an amazing machine, but it's also sort of interesting, though, that how much of our time with these machines, we're actually spending playing games, sharing memes, and sending cute animal videos to people. But I think that's a completely different topic we debate at another time. So now let's look at the actual application of AI in a specific circumstance. Jonathan's going to be doing the same in his presentation. And I think let's look at one of an increasing number of techniques that can help us with our work and our processes. And it'll come as no surprise to you whatsoever. I'm not going to talk about what he's doing, but I'm going to talk on my specialist subject of GreyList. So, GreyList. We actually don't call it artificial intelligence. I think, as you can see from the slide, we call it intelligent software. It's actually developed by a very, very clever colleague of mine I've worked with for 20 years called John Rawson. And he's almost 60 years old. He lives in Sheffield. He hardly ever leaves his data center, But if you met him, if you had a beer with him or a meal with him, you'd find him a remarkably ordinary, intelligent, diverse person, not the sort of Christopher Lloyd boffin from Back to the Future. So I think it is just getting some common sense ideas and employing people to the technical teams, I guess, to put them in a way that we can use as ordinary investigators or ordinary compliance people, but can make us achieve things quicker, better, cheaper, more comprehensively than we ever did before. And that basically is the genesis of GreyList. But what my friend, my colleague John has created is both something stunningly simple in concept, but also extremely complicated at the same time. And it's a tool, I think, that has the power to transform the asset recovery business, or at least the very early stages of it. So what the GreyList process does is track email contact between a person of interest, otherwise known as the target, the suspect, or the bad guy, or the bad girl, whatever you want to call that person, and every bank on our global database. And every bank now includes every secondary bank as it expands all the time to cover more and more financial institutions where people can hide and launder money. People sometimes ask, why don't you cover credit cards not associated to banks on your database as well? And the simple answer is a credit card is a good way to put a bit of money on and take money across borders. But with the way that Visa, MasterCard operate the system now, you're not going to get away with hundreds of thousands and millions of pounds by putting it on a credit card. So whilst we might get to it eventually, we're mainly now focusing on banks and major financial institutions. So why is it significant that we are tracking contact between an email address and every bank in the world? Three main reasons. Actually, got it wrong. Firstly, I think despite all the evolution in communication, and we're now using WhatsApp, we're using LinkedIn messaging, we're using Signal, we're using Telegram, all of these wonderful things. And we've also got the old-fashioned communications, which we still haven't totally forgotten, of actually picking up the phone or going there in person. Despite all of these wonderful technologies, the banking system still uses and is totally founded on a person's email address. You can't open a bank account anywhere in the world without registering an email address. And that's for not only the purpose of emailing your account manager, it's for purpose of internet banking, it's for purpose of fraud warnings, it's for purpose of recovery. And we're not going to get away from this email address for a very, very long time. And the reason for that is that banking software is incredibly antiquated and clunky. I think, when HSBC bought Midland Bank 30 years ago, amazing takeover, affected the UK banking industry. If you go and look at IBANs of some bank accounts, you still find MIDL included in them 30 years later. You can't shut down a bank's software systems. You can maybe shut a motorway or several lanes and cause inconvenience. But if someone told us, your bank account's going to be closed for the next month, hopefully it'll be open in time for Christmas, we're not going to be very happy about the idea. So the GreyList focus on email is absolutely correct because there is no other technology at the moment, whether it's apps or anything else, that doesn't rely on email. And secondly, while it's very interesting to establish if your person of interest has been in touch, let's say, with the marketing department of Barclays Bank, that doesn't get you very far. There are certain parts of banks which are whitelisted, where if you send them an email subject to the filters checking there's no virus or anything bad in the email, it automatically gets through. And so the fact that someone has contacted 50 banks' marketing department, no interest particularly to anybody, and luckily it's not what GreyList does. What GreyList is seeking to do is confirm the connection between your person of interest and those departments of the bank that actually deal with account management, processing of transactions, foreign currency transactions, and so on. And so we're testing communication. We're not invading banks and looking in their servers. That would be illegal. And the GreyList process is totally legal, and we have our legal opinions accordingly. But when you have communication almost certainly with those departments where your account is managed, your account officer sits, and your transactions occur, then our confidence that there is communication means we have an equal degree of confidence, and we work at a 98% confidence level, which is about as near as certain as you can be, given we are using the internet in a modern age, that there will be an accounting relationship. So we're going there to find the accounts by means of testing the communication. And so that is very, very important to understand. I think that in no way are we breaking any Computer Misuse Acts. We are testing communication, and communication is a wonderfully universal thing. It breaks barriers between countries who may or may not be cooperating in terms of sharing information. If you communicate with a bank through an email system, then GreyList will find your account. And I'm sure you may well have some further questions in this area that you may or may not have. Some of you may have asked my colleagues already, but if you do have any further questions, please get hold of me after. We're going to have some questions, I think, Jonathan, after at the end of this session, but we'll still be out in the lobby for the rest of the conference. So GreyList is a combination of an algorithm and a very complex database. If you have one and not the other, the process won't work. So the algorithm, a ping, a piece of code, whatever you call it, used with the wrong database or an incomplete database will not give you an answer of the right quality. If you have the database but you don't have the algorithm, that's not going to work either. And it's actually taken us 6 years to develop our banking database. It's incredibly complex. It recognizes how banks come and go day by day. It recognizes how banks are consolidating, getting rid of branches and creating regions. It also recognizes how secondary banks, who are sort of banks within banks, are being formed, where they're not covered by full legislation protection, but they use the accounts of existing banks to operate. And these are accounts, if you live in the UK, like Tide and Starling, where with a mobile phone in about 5 minutes, I literally opened an account in 6 minutes about 3 months ago, just by putting in my name and scanning my passport on my mobile, and next thing I've got a full international bank account with a MasterCard. Big contrast to how long it seems to take to open conventional bank accounts. So this combination is very, very important. And GreyList actually itself, even though it's been visible as a company for 18 months, and you first may have seen or heard of GreyList probably in March at the C5 forum in Geneva, with apologies to OffshoreAlert, but I think they and C5 exist in some, I think, happy coexistence. We first raised our flag. My colleague Bob Duffield made the presentation in Geneva in March. But GreyList was actually formed 6 or 7 years ago, as I've said, or the technique, within an existing corporate investigation company called Y Limited, set up in the City of London, which basically carries out a full range of corporate investigation activities. So we know the way it's done conventionally, and it's in response to the imperfections of that we put our heads together, worked with our technical guy, and came up with the product GreyList that I'm describing now. In order then to further develop GreyList, to make sure it was as efficient as possible and as broad as possible, we formed the company GreyList, and then via an EIS investment fund called Deepridge Capital, we raised £1.35 million for the company in April of last year. And that's enabled us to accelerate the technical development of GreyList, and also, of course, now fly our flag at international conferences like this one. And so what we have is this very interesting and complex database, a global database, on which we can run a global GreyList search. But we can also segment our GreyList search. We can cut it down to regions, to countries, even specific groups of banks. And we've gone through a number already of very, very interesting cases, which I can touch on later, where we've looked at banks on sanctions lists, for example. If you want to know if you're person of interest or if you're going to onboard a client and you're worried they may be connected to undesirable banks, let's say on the US government sanctions list, we can do that as well. It's a very small subset of our overall banking database. So what we're doing basically is reducing the universe, 250,000 banks in the world. Where is the money? We have no idea where the accounting relationship is, down to just a handful of banks. Ideally, I think it's the very first stage of your process. If you can narrow down the universe of banks to just 5 or 10 or 15, which is pretty much the number we have on the average GreyList investigation, it gives you a very, very big kickstart in the case. And these are banks that are delivered simultaneously in 4 or 5 weeks from the start of a GreyList investigation. It's not a case of paying someone to go and look for banks, not knowing how long it'll take or how long it'll cost, and then a week or two later, a couple of banks are found, then you spend a bit more time and a couple more are found, then you spend some more money, and another 1 or 2 are found, and over a very long period, you will get quite a lot of banks maybe, but over a very long duration at quite a significant cost, but it's not all banks connected to that person of interest. We do something very simple. We give you all the banks in 5 or 6 weeks for a fixed cost, entirely simultaneously, so that if your person of interest is keeping banks as bolt holes to move money to when, for example, they think the heat is on bank number 1, they want to move it to another one. If you already have a list of all the bolt holes they've set up, that's a very, very powerful technique, not only for further investigation or court action, but negotiation. We've had a case recently where the breadth and power and speed of the banks we found during a GreyList investigation basically caused the client to fold. The defendant just said, you know so much that we're going to basically throw our cards in and reach a settlement. And so all we're doing here is speeding the investigation process to make this an achievable end. So total length of a GreyList investigation, when I talked about US sanctioned banks, for example, 150, 200 banks out of 250,000, in processing time, it takes us 5 minutes. There's the logistics, though, of signing up the deal with the client, of putting it into the machinery to get everything working. But a typical GreyList investigation can take 6 weeks maximum when we're doing the whole world, but as little as 2 or 3 weeks if we're segmenting it into particular regions. And so that is the power. I think for some of you who are got information today and you're in court tomorrow, that's still not quick enough. We thought we were doing pretty well. You know, we can do the whole world in 6 weeks. And then someone said on our very first conference, you know, why does it take so long? You know, why can't I have it tomorrow? And I think the answer is yes, quite possibly in a few years' time, we're going to give you an app. You're going to put the email addresses in when you go to bed. And when you wake up in the morning, you're going to have all the results you need. And I think that'll be an incredibly powerful technique, not only for banks, but by then we've probably extended to crypto exchanges and a number of other databases as well. But the real issue here is that the world of banks connected to the internet is not a homogeneous place. I think we all know how weird and wonderful the internet is. The speed of the internet in one country to another country can vary significantly. The reliability, the speed of my internet at home changes hour by hour, minute by minute, second by second even. And so we have to go as GreyList by taking our piece of code and throwing it at our database. We're basically calibrating the speed of the internet for every bank in every country. And that takes a little bit of time. And sometimes we get strange results coming out. You know, there's a particular country where we seem to have selected every bank where we'd expect none at all. Then you discover there's been a cyber attack against that whole country the day before. We have to go and do it again just to make sure we get the accurate result. In recent cases, looking in the Far East, we find banks globally everywhere. It doesn't matter what language of the country. The email system is a global system primarily in the English language. So it doesn't matter which country it is. We cover every 200 plus countries in the world. But different countries do have different levels of protection of their internet systems. And with the troubles in Hong Kong recently, for example, the Chinese government put up some extra barriers to the internet, made grey listing and any other communication more difficult, but it didn't defeat us. A week later, we'd found our way through this extra protection, and we had managed to get the results for that country as well as every other country in the globe. So to keep it simple, and I think we invented this very sophisticated product naming structure over a glass of wine in about 5 minutes in a wine bar in Ludgate Hill. I think Bob and I was there, and one or two other colleagues. GreyList Gold is our gold standard service. A grey list of the entire world in a maximum of 6 weeks, 250,000 banks, it's done. GreyList Silver is a product where you can come to us. We have certain defined regions already set up, but you can come to us and say, look, I've got a very particular circumstance. I'm interested in the following 200 banks, the following 1,000 banks, the following 4 countries. Can you segment your database so we can do it quicker and cheaper just to give a result for those countries? I think the answer is yes, we can do that. We call it GreyList Silver. To give you one example of an actual case we did for a UK law firm 2 months ago, they wanted us to look at just 13 countries. It was in relation to a judgment. There was what they believed inadequate disclosure by the 3 defendants of which banks they were holding assets. And so we segmented our database down to 13 countries. These were the countries where typically when these defendants set up their corporate structures, if you were sitting in London and said, which country in the world should I set up my offshore vehicle or non-UK vehicle, then we end up with Cyprus, Gibraltar, we end up with the Cayman, the BVI, we end up with a series of countries in those jurisdictions. We grey listed 20 email addresses in 2 weeks, covering the 13 countries. We found 13 banks in 6 countries, which was 9 more than the client knew about. We prepared then an output report. We have a standard output report which we can share with you as an example as part of the provision of the GreyList results. We have an output report. We prepared that output report with some additional sections that we put in to allow it to be taken in front of a judge to grant a freezing order. And so all of that was totally on track. The barrister of our client said, well, this grey list seems pretty good, but actually you've missed a bank. You didn't get Alpha Bank in Moscow. And we said, great, but you didn't ask us to look at Russia. So maybe, you should have asked us to do a global search because you never know where else a bank may appear. And so it's a difficult conundrum in a way. Should I do global or regional? Because at one level, people have said to us, we're really interested in all the results, but if they're in certain countries or continents, like to pick Africa as one example, there are a number of countries there where the judicial system isn't going to be our friend. So if you find banks in these certain countries, then we're not really going to be able to enforce our judgment. Equally, we've done grey lists where people have assumed that all the banks are going to be in Europe, because that seems to be the entire pattern of activity of the person of interest and where the family is and where the kids go to school. So we've looked at Europe as a very logical place. And then we find there's one bank account in Hong Kong, one in Ecuador, and one in Angola, which I think by conventional investigation, no one would really have any chance at all of finding. So we can be very flexible. So as a company, If you're interested and you pick up the phone to me, to Bob, to any of my colleagues, John and Craig, to Arena, we can just talk to you and fashion a grey list to some extent that will fit your purpose. And then our newest, I guess, and a very prospective area is GreyList Red. And this is a KYC tool. I've talked about sanctioned banks. If you're opening an account at a bank, if you're applying for a loan, if you're onboarding a client, if you're a law firm, an accounting firm, an investigation firm, and you want to make sure that your client doesn't have connections in undesirable territories, then how do you do it? UK banks are telling us, we're discussing with a number of UK banks, we can't get information from every country in the world as to whether people have accounting relationships. We have some databases, but we're limited. And that's by countries not communicating with other countries, agreements being clunky about release of information. And again, as I said, because of the communication aspect, that doesn't affect us. If there's an email connection with a bank in any country, anywhere on the planet, we're going to find it. And also a GreyList Red type application, if you're looking at a divorce case where there's a Schedule E disclosure as you'd have it in the UK, certain banks have been listed, and we GreyList and find more, then that disclosure is shot to pieces. If you've got a situation with a revenue authority where a taxpayer has declared income in certain countries but turns out to have bank accounts in more than that, then why? And so I think, that's a very good question to be asked. We can even, in the core of GreyList, person of interest, every bank in the world, the core of GreyList is the person of interest is email address 1. Every bank in the world is a collection of email addresses. We can reduce that to a single email address and even establish with the GreyList procedure, has email address A ever communicated with email address B? And if someone has gone to court and declared they've never communicated, we GreyList the emails and find they have, another very powerful technique. And on one of our recent assignments, we did 3 in a row for a very major international investigation firm, got some very interesting results which confirmed what they knew and added something they didn't. They then came back to us and said, well, can you do something more? These 3 cases, they said, we didn't tell you, but they're all interrelated. It involves some politicians, some businessmen, and some very clever professionals and tax advisors and accountants. We want to know the cross-connection communication between them. And so now we've just put in a proposal where we're taking, in this case, very complex, 320 combinations of email addresses, where they tell us that just one of them proving positive could make a fundamental difference to their case. So there we are. I think that's what GreyList does. That's something about how it came into being. We're calling it the new starting point for every asset tracing investigation. Ideally, I think you do it first. It shrinks the world down. But at a very early stage of your process, once you've established your person of interest does have financial resource, then I think GreyListing is a very effective and very powerful technique to use. So thanks very much. And this is Jonathan Benton. Blow them away.
Well, we'll see. I think, so I don't have an agenda in front of me, but I think we've got till 3:10, is that right? 3:10, something like that?
I think about 2:45, Jonathan.
Okay, so yeah, sorry. So I'll try and rattle through this so we at least have sort of 10, 15 minutes for questions. So by way of background, everybody, thank you, Nigel, for introducing me. Jonathan Benton. I'm a former senior detective. I was a detective superintendent in the Met Police and at the National Crime Agency, and I spent the last 10 years investigating corrupt politicians, which is incredibly, when you get to see the inside of Hosni Mubarak's lifestyle and so on, you actually see, to some extent, what Oliver was talking about this morning, how egregious some of the corruption is and the level of money that is just sort of thrown around, sadly. So back to I'm now running a small startup. We're called Intelligence Sanctuary, but really what I want to talk to you about is how kind of asset tracing is changing. 20 years ago, I trained as a financial investigator. I've been tracing assets for drug dealers and all that sort of stuff for many years. And then moving on to these huge international corruption cases, one of which you may know about, and I'll talk about a little bit. And even to my very last case, which the central bank governor for Nigeria took me to one side at one stage when I was in Abuja, and said to me, Jonathan, I'm pretty sure she's stolen about $40 billion US dollars. And that was the former oil minister for Nigeria, Alison Dizani-Madwekin. In the space of 4 years, she took 40 billion out of the state revenue from oil revenue from Nigeria. And how do they do it? We'll go through that. And how does artificial intelligence, or our understanding of artificial intelligence, how does it weave into it? And it is about intelligent information, really. And I think this is complement what my friends at GreyList are doing, and how they are using information and email addresses and so on to actually draw that association and go, yes, we definitely know that there is a relationship between this individual and this bank. So the kind of like what's out there and what's data, and it's the big thing that lots of people are talking about. I think I'll probably be bold enough to say that a lot of people don't really understand how much is out there. There's a heck of a lot of people that have no idea how much of their own personal data is out there. I can tell you, definitely. And but we look at sort of fraud is on the rise hugely. 17% increase is quite significant. The complexity of fraud, I can't remember, somebody showed you the sign of sextortion. No, that was another conference I was at this morning. First thing. But they showed a sextortion tape, you get, a woman appears on your phone and it's a chat, and you start chatting, and she says, take a photograph of yourself. And next minute, 250,000 being demanded off you and send it to a bank account. Well, that's now, anybody remembers the old 419 fraud? That is the new 419. That's how you do 419 fraud. You don't send somebody some email and say, so what you do is you get straight into their phone, you pretend to be Nina with very little clothing on, start chatting, and it is only blokes that do this, ladies, only blokes do this, take their clothes off and start taking photographs of themselves, and Nina, and then suddenly it's been sent back to them and they've been told to pay a load of money. These are all the new frauds. This is how and this is how it's working. If we look at London alone, there's 33 billion in property owned in London by offshore entities. And it's the offshore entities. I want to show you a very quick clip of a video in a minute. This is not bashing up the overseas territories. That was just, I'm not going to go there because it's not right. But let's face it, this structure, the financial structure, the way it's set up now, both offshore and onshore, and facilitated by the City of London, means that this veil of anonymity was and still is to some extent relatively easy to maintain. Get yourself a corrupt professional, a corrupt lawyer, a corrupt accountant, etc., and the world is your oyster. But data, what's coming. So 680 million tweets a day, 2.2 billion active Facebook users, over 100,000 domains registered every day. We love domains, email addresses. We find people through IP addresses. That's the new way of tracking people. And I think, about the number of emails, and just kind of by way of example, before I show you the offshore thing. Anybody in here who's an investigator or a lawyer will know there's been a fairly analog approach to this. You go and try and find who's behind the corporate veil. Sometimes you may never get behind it because it is in a highly secret jurisdiction and there is no way. You may get a court order and compel them and eventually get there. There's lots of ancillary information now around those companies that can allow us to be able to, if we have the right tools, to go, actually, we're pretty sure Jonathan Benton owns this company. We're fairly confident now, so we can start to move much closer. And it may be then that we're starting to use the email addresses that we've recovered that are linked to the company to then understand what the banking relationship. And that name may be nothing to do with my personal name. It could be a whole load of obscure names that companies have been created in. And I think just before I go, so this kind of analog approach and the digital age and the kind of where the role of artificial intelligence is. I remember sort of 4 or 5 years ago, we'd been a team of very, very, very experienced financial investigators investigating corruption cases. It was always looking backwards. We were always having big fights with countries to get evidence out of them. We were always on the back foot. And I said, we've got to change this. You know, at the end of the day, if I'm trying to track an Albanian drug dealer who's bringing 5 kilos of coke in every couple of weeks, well, I listen to his phone, I monitor his computer, I put listening devices in his home if need be. All those tools are available to law enforcement, all of them, in the right circumstances, with the right authority, and so why don't we sort of take that approach with corruption? And I'm be bold enough to say as well that even where we are technically, or the technology and what we're applying, law enforcement is still probably 5 years plus behind, largely to do with money, because they won't buy the kit, which is very expensive. But taking this more proactive approach to monitor people, and let's face it, even some really high-level people, seriously, still don't turn their geolocation off on their tweets so you can follow them around the world. It's fairly, this is not rocket science stuff, some of this. So this kind of this approach of using data and using the right tools to crawl across data and to pull the bits of information out and to sort the false positives is really the way things are moving. But it's having the right tools to do that. And this is where I think really when I say that the role of the investigator is changing. And I have conversations with colleagues of mine that have got fantastic lists of contacts and networks. Yes, you still may need to speak to somebody. Yes, you may be dealing with something where it's all hidden behind trust. We're seeing increasingly stuff that would have been just behind a corporate veil is now put behind a trust because they know it's more difficult to get behind it. But ultimately, it's a combination now of using the information that's out there and understanding everything we can about that person. So I just want you to watch this, because this is the kind of nemesis, really, of it, you know. So this is now Jazeera documentary. It's very, very good.
One of the leading corporate service providers here. By staying behind, the client sets his manager, and she is freedom. The man announcement and his judgment. I must repeated his intention to open the company on my behalf, so that I would have no documented connection to the company whatsoever, something which would be against the law.
That's okay. You know the official owner, and we don't even ask you about your name or address or everything.
That's not almost very good, like he's an extra level, so that they're not bought anything about who the actual owner of the company is. You can appreciate that because my dad is on Zimbabwe, and then he's own officer in the Zimbabwean government, and they're rich and yes, we don't want to know that. I think that's the sort of things that we can't have knowledge. We have knowledge of that. We have to report. So I haven't heard a word you said in the last couple of minutes.
I was shocked to see how open they were to flouting the law. They clearly understood that they were dealing with a potentially corrupt individual, but they simply didn't care. Steve went on to describe how we could make it almost impossible for investigators to find out even analysis connection to the company by opening a chain of companies in different offshore jurisdictions.
Companies
That is not true. It is possible, but... So the reason I put that on is because I still think this is essentially my experience as an investigator and an asset tracing expert, individual, whatever the right title is. The corporate veil still is fundamentally the biggest challenge we face as investigators, trying to understand the assets that are behind it, because it is so easy. And this wasn't filmed too long ago, and actually, I was a bit annoyed with them because they filmed me and they cut me. But I think that was because I did a very classic police interview where it's all very, very stiff and it's not great for this sort of television. But I'll talk about this in a minute, because this is a case that many of you may know about or may have come across. But that whole issue of creating a company inside a company inside a company remains the fundamental problem we all face. Those companies will have bank accounts linked to them, the name of which will be nothing to do whatsoever, anywhere remotely close to the individual, anywhere. So finding it, getting behind it, and yes, jurisdictions are getting more and more open, and yes, we've got the EU directive, and yes, the EU corporate database, company databases with corporate registries is slowly moving through the other 27 member states in the EU and in other countries. But we're not going to see it in the US. It's opposed. There's a whole load of Republicans that are vehemently opposed against open registers and ever getting open registers in places like Delaware. It's just not going to happen. I can't see it happening. And I advised Prime Minister Cameron on this and did a number of the technical negotiations. In fact, it was some of the people in the room. So it's just not going to, we're a long way off. So how's it used? And this is, a real-life example. Many of you may remember the case James Abori, and I think it's an old case, but what I also want you to try and take away from this is this took 10 years of work. I had at least 6 people full-time every single day working on it. 10 years. Probably cost me about 12 million in staff time, serious amount of travel. They all had gold cards and everything because they were going all over the world, literally constantly, to try and gather evidence. And it took that long because it made, at times, even as law enforcement, it would take us months and months and months to get the information for the corporate registry from somewhere. In fact, places like Panama, never helped us, never did anything, never responded, didn't even answer the phone. So this is how, for any of you who want to know, this is how you buy yourself a private jet when you don't have any cash, or you don't have any of your own cash that you've kind of just done like most of us normally do, go to work and earn it and put it in a bank and spend it. This is when you're using somebody else's money. And what James did here, for those that don't know the case, maybe, he worked in Wicks here in South London. He was dual national, Nigerian, UK national. He had I think it was, if I remember rightly, Goldman Sachs account for some reason here in London. He wasn't a Goldman Sachs type client at the time, definitely not. He did become one, and the Goldman Sachs bank has just gone to jail. So what James did, he was working in Wicks, he was stealing drills, he got the sack, because him and his wife, and they thought, right, we're going to make our fortune, we'll go back to Nigeria. So he started laundering money for the former military dictator, Sani Abacha, and he was putting money through this Goldman Sachs account he had. He then quickly ingratiated himself with the who's who list in Nigeria and became state governor of Delta State. For those of you who don't know, Delta State is the oil-rich state. It's the jewel in the crown if you're going to nick money. It's the one place to go to. And very, very quickly, he started stealing money. And he did this with the help of a number of professionals. A guy called Bhadrash Gohil, lawyer based here in London, small practice. I always think the irony of it, Bhadrash Gohil was the money laundering reporting officer for the firm. And he laundered hundreds of millions. I'll show you in a minute how he put it all through the client account. And these companies here that you can see were essentially the first stage of how they started to get the money out of Nigeria. Some of it, MER Engineering. MER Engineering was a UK-based company and same name, same registry in Nigeria. Chevron were paying money, and they gave a very vague explanation when we asked them why they'd paid, over £1 million into a bank account for James Abori. It was to do with security, they said, and various other things, and that was it. It wasn't. Well, I'm not going to say what it is because I'm not a policeman anymore, and somebody might sue me, and I don't want the hassle of it. But it wasn't legitimate payments, obviously. So MER Engineering, these companies, it's the kind of money laundering kit. Lawyer, get your companies, and then your companies get the bank accounts of the companies. And then you can start the whole process of layering and layering. And this is exactly what he did here. You can see here just from this loan, this is at the beginning, this woman, Pogerson, she was kind of an absolute nobody, really. She was called special advisor. Essentially, her job was to open bank accounts on behalf of Abori, or have them opened. The lawyer had a number of relationships with relationship managers at banks. He would, I've got a great client. Account would be opened in no time. Some of these, when we looked at the due diligence, it was quite shocking, but I think in defense also to the banks, times have changed. Some of this is going back some time now, and a lot of this would never have got through the system now. I haven't got time to go through these in detail, and you probably don't want me to. But what we're trying to articulate here is to show you the different entities in which were created, and created for one reason and one reason only: to hide and to give legitimacy. So you go to Bombardier Jets and you say, right, my mate in whatever state has just bought himself a beautiful private jet. I need one because I've got to keep up with him, which is exactly what Abori did. And went to Bombardier, but he can't go to Bombardier Jets, and he can't just hand the cash over. So these companies were created, and even with names that would be acceptable to a multinational aircraft manufacturer. Okay, and some of them have even got aeronautical names attached to them. You'll see there that all the usual spots used, Geneva, Stanhope Investments. But what was really important here, and what was really interesting, was that two big pieces of money. They came through all these made-up rubbish companies that were only there to layer money, and it came through in two directions. One bit through the Arlington Sharma's account, and the second bit was through some transactions I'll show you in a minute. So they essentially layered the money, and then the lawyer put it all through his client account. This alone took probably 3 or 4 years just to uncover. So my bringing this back to the artificial intelligence point, my point being, times have really changed. We would do this in significantly quicker now, and be able to not cut corners, but we would be able to miss out some of the obstacles that are there. And then, finally, Bhadrash Gohil gets all the money over the right-hand side to the jet, but here, it's even things like, so they used bogus companies, and then the second thing they used was buying dollars, on the market for Naira, which, if any of you are bankers or lawyers, you would have come across this. Still a very, very common way of laundering money. You buy, particularly in jurisdictions like jurisdictions like Nigeria, where the naira is a closed currency. What you do is you sell your packet of naira and you buy dollars, which you can then trade with. Hyundai need naira to pay their staff. They've got dollars coming in, they sell dollars. Why is this important? Well, it was obviously important to do the money laundering case, but for now, all those names would be critical to us because they would be part of the really sophisticated searches that we do to be able to understand where the relationships exist. So, what are we, the kind of evolution of technology and where we are. So IP and email addresses to us, email addresses are critical. They're really, really helpful. In much the same way as GreyList have developed the technology to get behind email addresses. For those that aren't techies, and there might be some techies in the room, and I'm not a techie, you know, my 14-year-old still needs to fix my iPhone, but I do run a tech startup, but I do know how to find money. So for any of you that ever want to instruct us, please be reassured you're in safe hands. My point being that IP addresses and emails now they contain so much data and so much information that allow us to link back to the IP, to link the IP to the company. And I'll show you an example in a minute where we kind of cut through what we would have done in the old analog days, would have taken years. We cut through it literally in weeks. So I just want to jump, to this. I'm going to come down to the second example first. So, and I know that there's a number of lawyers in the room as well, and I've put a lot of cases through the courts over the years. I know how challenging these matters are, but there is information now. If you it was a huge bank loan that was in default, and essentially, like happens all too often, people create a story, they borrow a bit of money, a bit like the Moldova scandal, and then they borrow and borrow and borrow, and eventually they run off and nobody gets any money back. The bank in this instance had said it had a relationship with a number of companies in the UAE that it was trading with. It was trading commodities. They didn't pay the money back. We can't give you your money back, bank. Fine. We've sued them. We've even taken them to court. We're trying to... When you get behind that and go, hang on a minute, right, let's understand what the mothership, the big company, looks like. And let's understand what their IP, all their email addresses, who all the kind of key players are in the company. What we were then able to do is to link them directly, really, really quickly, to the companies that they said they knew nothing about. All we do is trade with them. It's utter rubbish, utter rubbish. It's like the stuff you see in Ukraine and the big Russian laundromat. These are just companies purely created to offer a facade, to put the money through. They had, you know, there were email accounts linked to these in the background. Straight away, it was very, very obvious that this story wasn't true. Now, of course, one, knows that if we're going to put this in court, and even if we're going to explain it to a 72-year-old judge that has got an iPad and that's it, and his grandson has to set it up for him, it's not easy, and we know that. And actually, we've got to think a bit more innovatively and about how we get the information, how it's presented. But my point being that this data is readily available, and it's available in seconds, literally seconds. And it can stand up to scrutiny. And yes, we still may need to go and get the original documents at some stage. But if you're trying to trace assets and put some sort of freeze on them, you've got fairly quickly quite strong, compelling evidence that even if you put in an application, potentially, to put on a freezing order, you stand a much greater chance of being able to throw the net as wide as you possibly can and secure the assets before they start getting dissipated and disappear. So this is kind of how it works. We do want to have, we've got 15 minutes, I think, left. It is these different data points. It's not an exact science, of course it's not. But I talked to you right at the beginning about a case, Alison Madwecki, the oil minister, and how much she stole. Her son and a whole bunch of other people that worked with her were principally involved in creating companies that then were miraculously got the prospecting license, and lo and behold were then able to go and sell, because often what they did was just flip the license. So they would buy it for next to nothing, or there was no proper true consideration in contractual terms, never paid for it, and then they would flip the license and sell it, and lo and behold, in less than 2 weeks, because my mum signed it all off, I've just made £300-400 million. Fantastic, you know, but of course it's all criminal. Now, these companies, just having a company that has no other presence whatsoever, doesn't have a website address, doesn't have a domain that you can go to, it's not going to get through it's not going to get through anywhere. I'd be bold enough to say it's not going to get through any Western due diligence process with a bank. I just can't see it happening. Because there are a bunch of basic checks you do, and you immediately know it doesn't smell right, it doesn't look right. But then behind that website is a whole load of information that helps us understand who the real people are behind it. That then, extrapolate that out to everything across social media. So all data points, structured or unstructured, and for those that are not familiar with those terms, the kind of unstructured bit is the bit that could be on a document, it might not even be on a readable document, it might be in any foreign language, and it's not indexed by Google in any way, because as many of you will know, information on the internet which comes back largely on a Google search is only coming back because Google thinks it can make some money out of it some way. It's the only reason it's in there, and has got it. So there is a massive amount of information out there. 27% of the internet's in the English language. Most of us search in English. Most of us, not all, but so having the ability to crawl across in any language, and I describe it as, it's like teaching a 5-year-old to do something. It's not this super brainy 5-year-old that can suddenly go and do things that you just don't understand, and it can go and find all this information. You have to teach it. We have to build algorithms. We have to explain to it to say, cut that off, but find anything there, and in any of these languages. But by building that, you build this perpetual search that keeps scraping and scraping and scraping and scraping. For those of you that have done any work in Russia, you may know this, but not many people do. If you're a Russian expat, your tax returns are a public document. They're a public document, but they're in Cyrillic. Some of it's handwritten. Some of it might, to have something that can crawl across that, pull out a company name or even a part telephone number and link it back to help build your organogram, your tree, your picture. That's where we're going. That is absolutely where we're going. It really is. And I'm back to my point about the legal side of it. It's information a lot of the time. Sometimes I call it stuff when my geeks come back and they give me loads of stuff. It's stuff, just come back to me with evidence and information. I don't clean that up because we're not going to, But that's out there, and that's how and it's only getting, from the figures I gave you at the beginning, it's only getting bigger every single day. So, my business partner's Australian. He's a former soldier, but he's very clever, and he thinks he's got a sense of humour. And when he wrote this, I'm not a cyber geek. But that's it from us. We've got 10 minutes or so for questions. I'm sure hopefully there are some. We've got a roving mic, or do you want me to do it? lot of
Thank you. My question is to, it's regarding what you mentioned about GreyList. You mentioned emails and emails with between individuals and the bank. I mean, how on earth do you get the emails?
I think on a typical, can you hear me without a microphone, by the way? I'm normally considered to be very loud, but can everybody hear me at the back without a microphone?
Yeah.
Well, we typically work for people like you, I guess. We tend to work for lawyers, we work for litigation funders, we work for forensic accountants, we work for, could be revenue authorities, whatever it may be. And so the art of the investigation is to assemble the population of email addresses that are relevant to the person of interest. Now, we've worked on cases where it's been going on for years, where actually the client didn't even have an email address for their person of interest. I guess the work they were doing was more relying on the name, the location, by conventional investigation methods to find out information, by social media scraping, which is much more common nowadays. But generally speaking, the client will have one or more emails of that person of interest, corporate or private. Quite often the corporate ones are the easiest ones to have because that person may have worked in a company. But of course, if you're going to steal a lot of money using a corporate email address, unless it's your company with no organisation, is a pretty silly idea, because the first time you get an email bounce, the system administrator gets something very interesting coming back. So we get a small number of email addresses. We have a special unit, I suspect Jonathan has one as well, in our office that's very expert at validating email addresses, looking at them to make sure they're real in an email structure, but also, rather importantly, they're of the right person.
Yeah, but then you want to establish the relationship of this person with a bank. I mean, how do you do that?
So you basically assemble your population of emails. People have multiple emails generally. Quite often you can find, by looking at the IP, looking at the flow of traffic, addresses in addition to the ones that are given to you. We then take those email addresses. They're given to us by the client under contract. They're going to warrant that they are legally in possession of those addresses, and there is a purpose for those addresses. If they're not, then we won't run it until that sort of evidential information is ready. We then basically take that email address or group of email addresses, we turn it into an algorithm, effectively a little package, piece of code, and we throw that piece of code against our global banking database. But it's a global banking database, but not into the bank. We're not going across the banking lines into the bank servers. That would be illegal. Mm-hmm. You're already offending the Computer Misuse Act and all related legislation. We interact with the spam filters that sit outside the bank. And it's by effectively chasing negatives, looking at the way that those spam filters deal with our piece of code, gives us the evidence that either they've seen that piece of code, that characteristic before, or they haven't. In 249,990 cases, we're very disappointed we get a no. But when we don't get a no, it means by deduction we have 5 or 10 or 15 positives. And what that effectively means is that if you have an accounting relationship with a bank, you have to register your email address for internet banking, for communication, for fraud alerts, for recovery. And hence the name GreyList, for example, your email address is whitelisted by the bank. So when you use that address in future, or whenever it is used, it will go through the bank as though it's an acceptable email address. We are testing to see if that can happen, and it's a mechanism that involves calibration of the internet and a timing mechanism. If I, for example, try and email your bank account manager, my email won't get through. However wonderful and respectable I am, even if I work for a great company called GreyList, they won't let it through because I have no purpose to email your account manager because I don't have an account at your bank. And they don't want certain key functions of the bank, like account managers, transaction processors, foreign currency dealers, to receive emails that come from the general public from anywhere. So they're very heavily restricted, that the only emails that will get through are for existing customers. And that's what enables us to tell. So if it's you, if this packet has your characteristics, we will see it's whitelisted. If I do it, it gets delayed. It gets kicked into the sidings we call the grey list. And we know from the difference in timing, it's milliseconds between those two events, whether this package, these characteristics have been seen before. So it's very simple but very clever at the same time, and totally legal.
Can I just ask a quick question, Nigel?
Yeah.
So as I understand it, when you get a response, you don't necessarily, because some of these people like we did, they would not be uncommon to have upwards of 100 accounts.
No, absolutely. Email addresses.
And bank accounts.
Okay.
In a big complex, and you'll bring all of those back.
All of them.
And is it perpetual? Would you keep, so if I'm changing, do you do that? Or?
Well, in terms of perpetual, I think, I guess if you then the following day go and open up another bank account, I guess if we then GreyList you the following day, then it'll reveal the new connection. If you close a bank account, then I guess they don't wipe immediately the connection of that email connection. It may stay there for statutory or other reasons for a number of years. And so in a GreyList, I think it's a remarkable technology, but we don't know what's in the account, how much money. It could be a personal account, it could be a corporate account, but it could reveal an account that's already been closed. That may be a good thing or a bad thing. Generally, if you're going to go for discovery, 3 things you can do with a GreyList result. You can use it as a basis for further investigation. You can go and negotiate with it, because I used the example where the power of the information sort of almost overwhelmed the defendant, that the game was up. Or you look at a legal procedure. Are you subpoenaing banks? Like in the States, for example, you could subpoena 100 banks. They'll charge you $1,000 each. You spent a lot of money to find out which ones are relevant to your client. If you GreyList the United States, it'll cost a fraction of that. And we'll say, well, here are the 6 banks you should go to. Just don't blanket everybody. So it's quite versatile in that respect.
We've got, it's 1:45. We take 3 quick consecutive questions, and then we will be really quick feeding them back as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
If that's okay with you, with the audience, because you've got to go and have your cup of tea and coffee.
My question was in relation to cryptocurrency. In your opinion, Jonathan, whether as organisations in the private sector, we're well positioned to trace assets when people are reverting to using Bitcoin and cryptocurrency?
So much better. So much better. I mean, one of the tools we do, we'll look at the exchange, and then we'll follow the code, the blockchain between the exchange and the account user, where it's held. So, but that technology, we buy it in essentially, it's only been going for now, from an asset tracing perspective, for a couple of years. I know law enforcement are way behind. Sorry, I did say we'd take 3 questions.
Well, I think Tom Clark and Warren Black are talking about busting the blockchain directly next, in fact.
So it is good, though. The technology is getting really good. Really good. Do you want to, Ewan, can you be really quick, Ewan? Sorry,
No. I'll understand, Jonathan, if you don't answer this question, but are you, as a company, you've clearly got ahead of the game, fully up ahead of the game, probably, you've got experience of the big cases, but are you or sensitive bit, your law enforcement former colleagues. Are you coming across any cooperative or semi-cooperative jurisdictions where the level of cooperation is starting to go materially down? Thank you.
And boom, sir. No, you're not.
Come to the stage, use the mic here. Come and join us.
Is that working?
Hello, that's better. Two questions. Firstly, when you do your data scrapes in relationship to the accounts, what would happen subsequently if the person you are data scraping then applies to you for assistance? How do you deal with a possible conflict of interest? The second point is that when you do your searching there, it must relate to cost. What's your average cost that you would charge to do a scrape? Because it is relevant.
Was there one more question? Was there one more? Or, should I very quickly do with you, and then you want to deal with?
Well, the gentleman there with the beard, I think, has been put his hand up first to ask you a question.
Good task.
We've answered already.
Yes, you. Very quick answer to your question. It's quite difficult to say because I don't have the same cooperation with jurisdictions like I would do when in my old world I could pick up the phone to the DVI and within 24 hours they were sending me a corporate registration certificate and who the beneficial owners are. Obviously you can't do that now. You have to work around other ways. But what I would say is I'm increasingly concerned about the UAE and Japan because I did some work for George Clooney last year, not to remember, he put a load of money into trying to trace illicit money for weapons and stuff. And every single time it just went back to the UAE, the gold that was being stolen went back to the UAE. It's just alarming. And I've got colleagues who work at it, and I know the level of work that they're doing, and it is nowhere near what it should be, given the amount of dirty money going through the part of the world. Do you want to do the gentleman?
Was that question to me?
Yeah, well, it was your conflict of interest, how you deal with conflict of interest and taking to you, and I suppose even if...
When you say conflict of interest, particularly where a lawyer, a client is hired as to investigate a person who may have judgments against them to look for bank accounts. So, explain to me, sorry, I missed it. What's the conflict of interest potentially?
Well, I'm asking you this. Basically, you get hired to do a job, and subsequently the person that you investigated might come along and ask you to do something. Are you conflict?
Well, I think we clearly look, we have as much know your client AML checking as anybody else as to whether we take on a client, and if that person we consider to be undesirable, and there was if we're already working to have investigated, there's probably prima facie evidence that they would not be a client we wish to have. But you don't always know who the good guys and the bad guys are in this world sometimes. You'll think you're working, you always want to work with the good guy against the bad guy, but it may be proven otherwise. But I agree.
Thank you for your time. Thank you for